Hi Year 11, this is a exam review of the Specimen B1 Biology paper for Unit 1. I'm going to go through this as this is for higher tier. If you didn't sit the higher tier exam paper, you need to look at the foundation video instead. You should be using a green pen to complete any corrections that you need to, and if there's any that you've really struggled on or really couldn't understand, make sure you put a star or something next to the question so that you can bring those questions to a member of staff and we can help explain them a little bit more clearly in case I don't manage to do that on the video. Okay, so we'll go straight into it, looking at the first question. It says hormones regulate the functions of many organs. Complete the following sentences. Hormones control the monthly release of an egg from the woman's, we should have ovaries for that one, so ovaries or ovary would be accepted. Hormones also control the thickness of the lining of her, and then for that one it will either accept uterus or womb. For that one it will allow either of the words for those. And then 1C, hormones given to women to stimulate the release of eggs are called, if they make the woman release eggs, it makes them more fertile, so they're called fertility drugs. Okay, so nice easy 3 marks there on the first question. Move on. Question 2. Student grew a plant in an upright pot. She then put the pot in a horizontal position and left the plant in the dark for 2 days. Diagram 3 showed that the potted plant after 2 days in the dark. Explain fully why the plant responded in this way. So this question is looking at the topic of nerves and hormones, and it's looking at how plants respond to certain conditions in their environment. Now there's certain key bits that you have to pick out for this question that some people didn't manage to get, and we're just going to look and identify those now. So it says she put the pot in a horizontal position, so it was flat, and it was left in the dark for 2 days. Now a lot of people missed out this bit about it being in the dark and talked about this plant responding to light. There was no light for it to respond to. Therefore, the only thing that it can respond to was gravity, and that is called a geotropism. Okay, so we'll link that in a second with the answer that we're going to provide. So, if you look at the number of marks available for this question, it's a 4-marker. Therefore, that means that we need to mention 4 key points in order to get maximum marks. Now, the first thing that you need to be thinking about here, if it's talking about plants and it's anything to do with plant growth, then that involves a hormone called auxin. So, you need to mention that the hormone auxin controls plant growth. And then the next thing after that you need to say is that because the plant is laying down flat on its side, so we'll do a little doodle of it now. So let's pretend that this is the plant flat on its side. Because it's flat on its side, gravity is going to pull the auxin hormones down towards the lower side of the plant. This is a response to gravity. So we've got the auxin collecting there on the bottom of the plant, on the bottom of the shoot, sorry. And then the next thing that you need to say is that the auxin causes this half of the plant, so we're talking about this half here, to grow at a faster rate than the other side. Therefore, what that's going to result in is, as you can see here, the plant is going to curve upwards. Okay, and that's what you need to say for the 4th and final marks. Now, bearing in mind this is only for the stem, in the roots it's the opposite. It's the side that's got the least amount of auxin that is going to grow the most. And that's what makes the roots grow down. Okay, so in the roots, so we'll just label this as a stem. If it's a root, then it's going to be the opposite. So we're still going to have the auxin collecting on the bottom of the plant. With roots, it's going to be this top side that grows more, and that's going to result in it going down like this, because that side is growing a little bit more. Okay, next question. Question 3. So we've got a drawing of a dandelion plant and goose grass. Drawings are not drawn to the same scale. Use the information in the drawings to answer the question. Explain one way in which dandelions are adapted to live in lawns and in fields where animals feed. So there are a number of adaptations that you could have said of the dandelion. We'll zoom in on that for a little bit. As you can see straight away, the leaves of the dandelion are towards the bottom of the plant. There's none of them up towards the flowery part here. They're all close to the bottom. So that could be a description that you provide there, and then for your second mark you need to say why that's going to give that plant an advantage. A reason for that is basically if the leaves are close to the ground, then it's less likely to be eaten. So leaves are closer to the ground, so it is less likely to be eaten. Most people did suggest that one. Another thing that you could say instead, so if you didn't want to go for that one, some other students were talking about the roots, so they said that it's got a thick root which prevents it from being pulled up. And obviously that's going to help it to survive more often than not, because if the root of the plant survives, then there's a chance that it can grow back. So that was what it was for the first one. We'll go to the goose grass now on the next page. Okay, so if we bring in a quick picture of the goose grass, and then we'll look at the adaptations for that. Okay, so there should now be a picture of the goose grass on the screen, and as we can see, the goose grass was a lot taller than the dandelions. It's almost a metre in height. So we can use this information to our advantage when we're answering the question. So it asks us to explain one way in which goosegrass is adapted to live alongside hedges. We know that hedges themselves are quite tall, but because of the long stem of the goosegrass, this will allow it to gain more sunlight. And obviously if a plant gains more sunlight, it can use more of that for photosynthesis, or more of the energy to allow photosynthesis to take place. It could have also mentioned another thing, which was that it has widespread roots. So by this we mean that the roots cover a large area, and that means that the plant can better compete for water and nutrients. Okay, so either of those is okay for the goosegrass. Next question. Question 4. Many diseases are caused by viruses. Children are given vaccines to protect them against viral disease. Complete the following sentence. It is difficult to kill viruses inside the body because viruses live inside cells. Okay, so that's what we need for that first bit. So once a virus gets inside our body, they go inside the cells, and they do that for the sole purpose to replicate themselves so that they can make more copies to invade other cells. Next bit then, a vaccine contains an either inactive, dead or weakened form of the virus. So your keywords there, inactive, dead or weakened, that you need to mention. And finally, the vaccine stimulates the white blood cells to produce. Thing that you need to mention is antibodies. Do not get those mixed up with antigens instead. The antigens are on the surfaces of the pathogens. Antibodies are what are made by our white blood cells to help to kill those pathogens. Okay. Very quickly, just group those together. Group those, and then we'll move them out of the way. Okay, so 4B. In the 1990s, many people thought that the MMR vaccine caused autism in some children. This is why the Japanese government stopped using the MMR vaccine. So the graph gives information about the percentages of Japanese children who developed autism during the 1990s. We're going to analyse this graph in a bit more detail on the next page, so we'll look at it in a second. Okay, so question 4B. The data in the graph support the view that there is no link between MMR vaccination and autism. Explain why. Okay, so minimise this and bring the graph over. And we can see a couple of trends in the data. So as the percentage of children vaccinated goes down, so it reaches a 0 point at 1995, there's been changes in the amount of children who developed autism. So between 1990 and 1992, it's going up, then goes down, and then there's a huge spike in 1995 when the number of vaccinations taken gets to 0, and there's a huge drop again. So what you need to spot here was that there was no correlation or no pattern between the MMR vaccine and the number of kids who were developing autism. So first marks then you can get for pointing out that in 1995 there's no vaccines. And there's also no link with developing autism. For your third and fourth marks, you just need to say that the number of children that develop autism peaks after they stop taking a vaccine. So as we've said, you can see here that it peaks in around about 1996 when there's no longer any kids being vaccinated, which supports the idea that there is no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. So just put that down. So autism peaks after 1995 when nobody takes the vaccine. Okay, so that was a 4 marker that you had to say for that one. The only final point is for suggesting that something other than the MMR vaccine must be causing autism. And you will have implied that by saying there's no link between the data. Okay, next page. Let's look at this one. This was a 6 marker on energy transfers, and it was generally not answered very well. A lot of people lost marks on this one. We'll talk through it and see if we can identify the main areas where people lost marks for this. Okay, so it says, in this question you'll be assessed using good English. Diagram below shows a food web, some of the organisms that live on moorland. So we've got our producer, which is the heather. We've got the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. It says only a small percentage of the sun's energy captured by the heather is eventually incorporated into the body tissues of the fox. Explain as fully as you can what happens to the rest of the energy captured by the heather. So the key things then that you need to do for this, you needed, so I think it was 6 examples of biology points. In order to get maximum marks, the mark scheme says there is a clear, balanced and detailed explanation of a large variety of ways in which energy captured by the heather is transferred. Credit may be awarded either for references to general ways in which organisms transfer energy, or to ways in which specific organisms in the food web transfer energy. So we'll go through some of the general ones first. The most general one that you needed to mention in order to get full marks is that respiration from living organisms releases energy. That was one of the main ones that you needed to mention, and it's one that quite a lot of people did manage to get. Another one that you need to mention is that energy can be lost through waste materials. So by that we mean feces. Okay. Some energy is used in maintaining or repairing animals. I think it would also allow it if you said growth there as well. So some animals use it for maintenance, growth and repair. So that basically means if you're repairing something, it's repairing an injury or a cut. Maintaining is making sure that new cells are being produced inside the body, and growth is making sure that the animal grows throughout its development. Another one that people mentioned, which quite a lot of people mentioned actually for this one, was movement. So energy is used for movement. So that could be a number of scenarios. It could be that they're moving around to evade predators. It could be that they're hunting. It could be that they're migrating. But energy is definitely used for movement. Another one is through heat energy. So when we respire, it it releases heat energy. Other ones, I'm not going to write these down, but some organisms can die. Actually, I will write it down. So some organisms die and can be broken down or decayed, decayed there being the key word, by microbes. You could say decomposers. Those would be classified as microbes as well. Or detritivores. Okay, so those were the key things that you had to say. So if you mentioned those points, that would allow you to get 6 marks. Okay, next question. Number 6, read the passage about the use of antibiotics in food production. People do not always agree about the use of antibiotics in food production. Some farmers put low doses of antibiotics in feed for animals such as cattle and sheep. Antibiotics help to keep animals disease-free, and antibiotics also help animals to grow. The use of antibiotics in livestock feed means that there is a higher risk of antibiotic-resistant bacteria developing, and these could be dangerous to human health. So 6A, explain how a population of antibiotic-resistant bacteria might develop from non-resistant bacteria. So basic things that you need to mention for this then are that within a population of bacteria, there are random mutations. So when we say mutations, that means that there's a change in the genetic code which is going to change a particular feature about that organism. So there's random mutations for bacteria. And what that will do is, just by chance, it means that some bacteria that have mutated, so not all of the bacteria, because it could be a different kind of mutation. So some bacteria that have mutated will now be resistant. And then the final mark is for saying that the susceptible bacteria will be killed. However, the resistant bacteria will reproduce and increase in numbers, and that's how the population of antibiotic-resistant bacteria comes about. So, however, the resistant bacteria will reproduce and increase in numbers. Okay, so it's 3 marker, that one was. Key things that you need to mention there in terms of keywords is that it's a mutation in their DNA or their genetic code. You have to mention that it's a mutation. Okay, so if we move on, we've got question 6B, and this one is saying, let's group these together so we can move them. Move that one up there as well. Suggests 2 reasons why it is an advantage to keep farm animals disease-free. Okay, so what you need to do for this one, there are 2 main things that are on the mark scheme. You could say that they don't have to use up energy in overcoming illness. That was one thing that you could have said. And the other thing could have been any economical reason, so it could have been it saves the farmers money, or you could have said if none of the animals are ill, then autocorrect, sorry, then they will be able to produce more product, so they'll be more productive. Those are the points that are on the mark scheme for it, folks. Okay, next question then, we look at question 7. Okay, so we've got a question on drugs. It says some athletes use drugs containing the steroid testosterone to improve their performance. In an investigation, scientists monitored the performance of 18 male athletes over a 6-week training program. 9 of them were given weekly injections of testosterone, and the other 9 were given a placebo. So placebo, keyword for this topic. A placebo is a fake drug. It's something that is given to a subject that doesn't actually contain a drug. It's given as sort of as a control group. Okay, so if we look down, we've got the results. So we've got a little bit of analysis with the graph here that we can do later. And it says for the first question, the data would have been better presented as a bar chart. Give a reason why. Okay, so for this one then, it's better presented as a bar chart because there's simply not enough data for a line graph. There are a couple of other things that I would have accepted on that one. I would have accepted it if you said that it contains categoric data and not continuous data. But that was the only other thing that I would have accepted. Okay, so we move that up, and then 7b. So guess what was given as a placebo in this investigation? You need to say that it was an injection that contained no testosterone. Okay, so the reason for that, the placebo doesn't actually contain the drug that the other group are getting. Okay, next page. Describe the results of the investigation. So we'll just really quickly bring in the graph from the previous question. We'll analyse that and then look at where we can get the 2 marks in this this question. Okay, so we'll bring the graph in now. We should have it ready. Okay, I'll make this a little bit bigger. So we're looking to describe the results of the investigation. It's a 2 marker. Now the trick with any of these sorts of questions that you need to make sure that you're doing is actually referring to some visible data that's actually on the graph. We'll look at that part for the 2nd mark, but we can see here we've got 2 lines. So we've got one for the placebo group showing their percentage improvements in performance over the 3 and 6 weeks periods that they've been taking part in the study, and we can see that after 3 weeks they've had a mean improvement of around about let's have a look at that. That's about 1.6%. Okay, so it's not a really huge amount, and after 6 weeks it's looking to be at about that's about 3% mean improvement. The testosterone group, on the other hand, theirs has improved at a much greater rate than the placebo group. So you got 1 mark for pointing out that the testosterone group had improved at a greater rate than the placebo group. And your 2nd mark was for saying that in comparison to the placebo group, the testosterone group had improved by 13%, which we can see there. So obviously you'd use a ruler in your exam to mark that off. So that's at about 13%, and the placebo group is at about 3%. Sorry that the lines are a little bit wobbly, but I've got to use my hands on the iPad. So yeah, that's what you get your marks for. So I'll just put them quickly on the paper for you so you can see it, just so that we've got it written down. So 1st mark, this was saying the testosterone group improved more than the placebo group, and then you get your 2nd mark for saying that they improved by 13%, if I can find that, over the 6 weeks. And then just compare that to the placebo group. So whereas the placebo group only improved by 3%. Okay, so any questions where you're having to describe data on a graph, that should be what you're looking to try and do. So say what the general trend is, and then for the 2nd mark, actually use some of the data that's on the graph there. Okay, right, so we move down now. Most internet advertisements for testosterone state that athletes need to use testosterone for at least 10 weeks to significantly improve performance. Do the results of this investigation support the statements in the advertisements? Well, if we look back at the graph, I'll just try and make this a little bit bigger. There we go. We can see that it's not just after 10 weeks. We started to see results pretty much immediately in the investigation, because even after 3 weeks there's been a significant improvement in the performance on the bench press. So it was literally just a 1 mark question. You had to say that no, it doesn't support the statement in the advertisement. No, because there was a significant improvement after 3 weeks. So that was just a 1 mark. You didn't need to go into any more detail than that. Okay, we'll turn over. Okay, so we are now on question 8, which is looking at the topics of the nervous system in this question, and it was one that students generally answered okay on. They were a little bit poor in some areas with regards to remembering keywords and the order that they had to mention those keywords. So we'll just look at this then. So we've got a diagram, and it shows a hand automatically moving away from a hot pan when they've touched it. It shows the structures involved in that. So we'll look at these structures first, and we'll label what we've got. We've got the finger, which is going to have receptors, and those receptors are going to detect temperature changes. And then the pathway that the receptors then send a nerve impulse to the spinal cord is along this little section here that I'm highlighting. And that first neuron, one of the key words I'm going to mention, I'll just do that in a different colour, is the sensory neuron. So that takes all the sensory information in the environment, and then that sends that to the central nervous system to be processed. So once it gets to the spinal cord, that is in essence the central nervous system, we've got another neuron which I'm labelling here, and that is the relay neuron. And that's got the simple job of just passing the message on, very similar to a relay race where they pass the baton on. It just passes the nerve impulse on to the next neuron. Next neuron in this example, we've got the motor neuron, which sends the nerve impulse to the muscle, which we can see labelled here. And this muscle, key word for that you had to include was an effector. And you had to actually say what the response was of the effector. There was another key point that you needed to mention for this, and that was mentioning something about a synapse, which we'll talk about in a second. So synapse is there. Okay, so we'll write this down neatly now. So describe fully how the structure shown in the diagram bring about this reflex action. Okay, so the first mark that you've got to start right from the beginning. So from when the person is touching the hot pan, you need to say that the stimulus is detected by temperature receptors on the skin. So notice there I was saying what kind of receptors they are. You need to include that level of detail to make sure that you're getting maximum marks on these sorts of questions. So first mark, stimulus is detected by temperature receptors on the skin. The second point that you should be saying is that the nerve impulse travels along a sensory neuron. So nerve impulse travels along the sensory neuron to the CNS, which is essentially the spinal cord. Now, if this wasn't a reflex action, then it could also be sent. Then it could be sent to the brain instead. That would also count as a central nervous system. What you need to say next is that when the nerve impulse is being passed on, sorry, I'll just move this down here so you can see it. So when the nerve impulse is passed on from one synapse to from one neuron to another, a chemical is diffused across the synapse. So like we said earlier, the synapse is the small gap between the neurons. Okay. Next point then you've got to say that the relay neuron passes the nerve impulse onto a motor neuron. So I'll put that in. So relay neurons in the CNS pass the nerve impulse to a motor neuron. Okay. The motor neuron then passes it to the effector. So put that in now. So finally, motor neuron sends the nerve impulse to an effector, which results in the response. Okay, those are the key things that you need to mention to get max marks in it, folks. So we'll start again. So stimulus is detected by temperature receptors on the skin. The nerve impulse is sent from the receptors along the sensory neuron towards the central nervous system. This actually happens by chemical messages being transferred through a synapse. So the chemicals diffuse across the synapse from one neuron to another. Relay neurons in the central nervous system pass the nerve impulse to a motor neuron. The motor neuron sends a nerve impulse to an effector, and then that results in a response. Okay, so it was quite a long-winded question for this one, but it's one that a lot of students made mistakes on, and it's one that you need to make sure you understand the keywords. So we'll just identify those keywords again, just so that everybody's sure on them. So we have got, I'll just highlight these actually, if I can. Here we go. Highlight them in blue. So stimulus. Oh, sorry, wrong one. So we've got stimulus. The stimulus is one. Receptors is another. So those are talking about the special cells that receive the stimulus from the environment. Sensory neuron. CNS, which stands for central nervous system. Synapse. Relay neurons. Motor neurons. And then finally effectors. So those are the keywords that you need to be mentioning for this sort of 6-mark question. Okay, moving on to the next page. Okay, the nerve pathway in this reflex action is about 1.5 meters in length. A nerve impulse travels at 75 meters per second. Use this information to calculate the time taken for this reflex action to occur. Show clearly how you worked out your answer. So it's pretty straightforward. You have to use the formula for speed equals distance divided by time. So speed equals distance divided by time. And we're looking for the time. So what we have to do there is we're going to do distance divided by speed. Okay. And the reason for that is when we rearrange the equation, we're looking for time. So time equals distance divided by speed. If you're not sure how to rearrange equations, one suggestion that I would suggest that you have a look at is looking at formula triangles, which looks at in a little bit more detail. If you're unsure on how to do that, then I'm more than happy to help any of you that need the help. If you just come and see me, and I'll give you a quick look at that. But for this purpose today, we're gonna skip over it because I don't want to waste too much time on the video. So we've got 1.5, which is our distance, divided by the speed. So 1.5 divided by 75 should give you an answer of 0.02 seconds. Okay, so that one was nice and easy for that one, so 2 easy marks for it. 8b part 2. The actual time interval is longer than the interval you have calculated in part 1. Suggest an explanation for this difference. The only thing that they would accept for this, it was nothing to do with reaction times or anything like that. That was something that a lot of people fell into the trap of putting. It was because of the chemicals diffusing across synapses when nerve impulses have to be passed between neurons. So it takes time for nerve impulses to be passed on because chemicals have to diffuse across the synapse. that's easy to see. That was the only thing that they would accept for this, and I think out of the papers that I looked at, there was only one person who got that one right, so that was one that tricked most people out. So pay attention to that one in future, please. Anything to do with speed of nerve impulses or the speed of a reaction, or something like that, you're looking at the time it takes for chemicals to diffuse across a synapse. Okay, next page. Okay, question 9. So diagram shows one method of cloning sheep. So we've got a white-faced male, and we've got a black-faced female, and it shows here a method of cloning. So we're removing the body cell from a male sheep, so we're taking one sample of one of its cells, we're taking an egg from a female, and this is the key bit here, we're removing the genetic material from the unfertilised egg, so we can see that the nucleus of that egg has been removed. So we fuse those two cells together, so we're taking the body cell from the male sheep and the empty egg cell from the female, and that results in a cloned embryo. So an embryo is a bundle of cells that have started to divide and will later develop into a fetus, and then the embryo gets implanted into a surrogate mother. So surrogate meaning that the mother is not actually its biological mother. Okay, so if we look down, and then that will result in a cloned lamb. So it says the fusion of the body cell from the male sheep and the egg from the female sheep is an example of asexual reproduction. Explain why. So it's a 2-mark question. Your first mark for this one was nice and straightforward. Anything to do with asexual reproduction means that there is only one parent, but you need to go a step further than that and say that there is no mixing of genetic material. So there's no mixing of genetic material. So that's for your first mark. Just move that there. And then your second mark is for saying that the reason we know this is because the nucleus from the egg cell was removed before the cells were fused. So nucleus from the egg cell was removed before fusion. As a result, that means that we've only got the genetic material of the male present there. Okay, next page. Give the gender and face colour of the cloned lamb. So we'll bring in the diagram again just so we can have a look at it. And what we can see here is, like we said earlier, it's only the genetic material from the male that actually gets used, because that's the only nucleus that's kept. So remember, the female nucleus from the egg cell is removed. Therefore, that means that all of the features of the clone are going to be exactly the same as the white-faced male. So therefore, that answers our question. The gender is going to be male, and the face colour is going to be white. And like I said, we know that because those are the only genes that are passed on throughout the cloning. The female's genes are not used at all. So that links in quite nicely with the next question. So give the reasons for your choice. You need to say is that the genes are only coming from, from the white male. So you get 1 mark there for mentioning that it's genes or genetic material, and your second mark is saying that it comes only from the white male. Okay, next page. And question 10. Theory of evolution through natural selection was proposed by Darwin. Explain how evolution occurs via natural selection. So it's a 4-mark question. There's always a set structure for these answers that you will always need to provide, and we're going to go through that now. So your first thing you need to say is that organisms within a population will always show variation. So organisms in a species show variation. So by variation, we mean that there are differences between members of the same species. Exactly the same way that in human males and human females, not all males and females will look exactly the same. So there's variation between us. And this variation actually takes place due to something called mutations. So this takes place due to mutations. Those mutations are random changes in the genetic code that can sometimes give the organism an advantage. Sometimes it's a disadvantage, sometimes it's an advantage. It all depends on what mutations happened. So those are your first 2 marks. Your third mark is for saying that the mutation may give the organism an advantage. And you could have given an example there if you wanted to, but it's by advantage, what we mean is something that is going to make it more successful at surviving. So it gets better at surviving. This is why it's called survival of the fittest. And your fourth mark is for saying that as a consequence of its surviving, so as a result of surviving, its genes are passed on to the next generation. Okay, so that was generally quite well answered. The only part that people were missing out for the mark scheme was this first bit here. So organisms in a species show variation. You have to mention that in order to get maximum marks on that question. Okay, so just very quickly group this together and then we'll move it down to our next one. There we go. So Darwin's theory was only gradually accepted. Give 2 reasons why. Main ones that you can say that are on the mark scheme. It says that it undermines God because people thought that God made all plants and animals. Okay, so that was one thing you could have said. Next thing that you could have said, and this is one that a lot of people did get, there was insufficient evidence, so not enough evidence at the time in order to prove it. And then the third thing that you could have said is that it was variation and inheritance was an unknown part of science in those days. Okay, so any of those 3 points would have been fine for the marks. Just very quickly make this a little bit bigger. Okay, that should be okay actually. So yeah, those 3 things that you could have said there. Any of those would get you the marks if you got 2 of them. Okay, and we're on to the last question now. So it's question 11. Read the information about the trialing of the first contraceptive pill. So we're going to look at this, we're going to underline some key bits of it, and then we're going to answer the question. So this is something that you should try and get into the habit of doing when you're in your exam. Underline any key bits that you find. So it says the pill was developed by a team of scientists led by Gregory Pincus. The team needed to carry out large-scale trials on humans. So we know it was a large-scale trial. That's one thing straight away. And we know it was on humans. In the summer of 1955, Pincus visited the island of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, so that means that there's a lot of people living within a small area, and officials supported birth control as a form of population control, so that might become significant a little bit later on. The women in Puerto Rico were mainly poor and uneducated. So by uneducated, it means they are not very aware of how these scientific experiments work, and they're very poor, which means they've not got money to access a lot of drugs that could be used as contraception. Scientists selected a pill with a high dose of hormones, so it contained a high dose, and the pill was found to be 100% effective when taken properly. So this links in, this when taken properly, links in with the poor and uneducated bits. We'll look at that again in a second. But 17% of the women in the study complained of side effects, which is quite a high percentage. The women in the trial had been told only that they were taking a drug that prevented pregnancy. They had not been told that the pill was experimental or that there was a chance of dangerous side effects. Okay, so we've highlighted some of the main bits there that we can mention. If we go down, evaluate the issues involved with methods used by Pincus in trialling the contraceptive pill. Now, evaluate has to mean positives and negatives, not just the negatives. A lot of people only mention negative points for this investigation, for this question, and that limited the number of marks that you could get. Okay, so positives, we'll look at those first. I will type these in. So a positive was it was a large-scale trial. And those are very, very useful because they give better results. I'll put useful. They give better results. So it will allow them to be more confident in the results that they obtain. He chose uneducated women. So we'll put this down next. So he used uneducated women. And the sort of logic behind this was if uneducated women could use the pill correctly, then women all over the world would be able to use it. So use educated women because if they could use it correctly, then all women could. Okay, so that there is also a positive, folks. Oops. That's also a plus. Now we're going to the negatives. Okay, so for the first one, the women couldn't give consent as they were uneducated. So that was one thing that they could have said as a negative. Another thing, there was no control group in the experiment, so there was no group to compare it against. So you could have said there was no control group. Or no placebo would be an easier way to put it. So by a placebo we mean fake drug doesn't actually contain the chemical that's actually been investigated. Will actually have no effect on the body. They used a pill with a high dose of hormone, which is another negative. They should have used a range of levels of hormone. Used a high dose of hormone, and they should have used a range. The reason for that is if they use a range of hormones levels, then they can find out what sort of level works best in the patients. Okay, just link these together. So group that. Just move this down a little bit. And then finally, this one was the one that most people managed to get. It was the most obvious point in it, was that the pill was experimental and the women weren't warned of side effects. Okay, so those are the negatives there. So we've got 6 points, 6 marks, and that was quite a nice one. It gives you a lot of information in the question that you could have used, so it gives you at least 3 easy points in the question. Then it depends on your knowledge to try and get the rest of them. Okay, right, so that's actually the end of the paper. If you have got any questions, please make sure to come and see me, and I will try my best to help you with those. Please make sure you bring these papers back in as well, because we can use them in case you're not there for your real exam. Okay, thank you.